They said he was just a journalist, another foreign visitor with a camera, a smile, and a mission to tell Africa's story, but in the heart of Burkina Faso, something didn't add up. What began as quiet curiosity soon unraveled into one of the boldest exposures of foreign espionage in recent African history. At the center of it all, President Ibrahim Traoré. Calm, calculated, and unshaken. He didn't need to raise his voice, because the truth spoke loud enough. This is not just a political moment, it's a turning point. And in today's video, we'll walk you through the full story behind how a spy was exposed, not with bullets, but with facts. Stay until the end. You won't want to miss what Traoré says in the final scene. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because we're bringing you stories that others are too afraid to tell. He didn't look dangerous. That was the point. His shirt was always pressed, his shoes spotless, and his tone measured, never arrogant, never timid, the type of man who blended in just enough to be forgettable, yet always noticed just enough to be trusted. At Ouagadougou International Airport, he presented his papers with confidence. Tourist visa, French passport, press accreditation from a small media outlet that barely had a digital footprint. The officer at the desk barely blinked. Foreign journalists passed through regularly, especially after recent political shifts, but this one was different, and not because of how he looked, but how he moved. Over the next several days, his behavior was, at first glance, unremarkable. He checked into a modest guest house near the outer ring of the city, away from embassy zones and hotel clusters. The staff there said he always greeted them in the morning, never asked for room service, and paid in cash, local currency neatly counted. He left early, returned late, and carried the same shoulder bag every day. Inside that bag, a camera, a notepad, 2 USB drives, and what appeared to be a small Wi-Fi device with foreign labeling. On his second day, he visited the central market, snapping pictures of vendors and interviewing locals about food shortages and trade routes. On his fourth, he took a taxi to the northern suburbs where a dormant railway station sat, one that happened to lie just 3 kilometers from a military equipment depot. He claimed to be filming the contrast between colonialist-era infrastructure and modern economic needs. The driver, a man named Issa, found it odd that a journalist didn't carry a tripod or ever asked to interview anyone formally. He didn't record voices, Issa later said, just places, always places. By the end of the week, the man, who introduced himself only as Jean-Paul, had been to 5 districts and taken photographs of 4 transportation routes that overlapped with national resource corridors. When questioned casually by a shopkeeper about what outlet he worked for, he said it was independent media doing research for a regional peace report. No one could find that outlet online. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't socialize. He declined invitations from curious neighbors to join them for dinner or tea, saying he was on deadline. But the strange part wasn't his reclusiveness. It was how precise he was. He always seemed to know the back roads. He took unusual routes between locations, often switching taxis mid-journey. At first, observers thought he was simply paranoid. But then patterns emerged. Every night, shortly after midnight, he powered up his laptop and connected to a private network not hosted in Burkina Faso. Analysts later discovered his device was routing data through encrypted servers in Europe and West Africa. These connections weren't casual browsing, they were uploads, large ones, entire folders transferred to anonymous repositories hosted in private clouds under aliases. None of this resembled journalism. When local intelligence began reviewing footage from street cameras and drones, part of a broader anti-infiltration program, they noticed something else. Jean-Paul always stopped walking when near antenna towers, always lingered by certain utility boxes. At first it seemed like coincidence, until they zoomed in on a frame from day 9. He was holding up his phone near a telecom cabinet outside a university campus known for housing a military R&D annex. The phone screen was facing the equipment. He wasn't taking a selfie, he was scanning. That image, combined with flight records and digital communication logs, was enough to trigger a formal investigation. His phone was cloned remotely. Texts reviewed, emails decrypted with government-level tools. What came out was alarming. Contact with an individual flagged in Côte d'Ivoire for espionage activities, exchanges using code phrases, GPS-tagged images of convoy routes, an Excel sheet listing the security personnel rotation schedules at 2 government facilities. Still, no arrests were made. President Ibrahim Traore was deliberate. His government didn't want chaos, and they didn't want an international scandal based on assumption. They needed undeniable proof, and they needed it to unfold in public view. What better way than to invite the man into the center of power and let him walk into his own exposure? So the press conference was planned, quietly, strategically. No international press. Only 6 local journalists were invited. No press kits. No leaked topics. The goal wasn't to inform the world. It was to confront one man, with the world watching afterward. In the days leading up to the event, intelligence agents made one final move. Under cover of darkness, they entered Jean-Paul's guest room, carefully, surgically. No signs of forced entry, no disturbance. They copied the contents of his laptop, verified that the incriminating files were still there, and left everything untouched. By the time he woke up the next morning, he had no idea he was already under full surveillance. He arrived at the presidential compound just before 10 a.m., wearing beige trousers and a loose white shirt, as if he had nothing to hide. Guards let him in with a smile. Cameras were already set. Chairs were arranged in a half circle. No one said much. The air was too thick with anticipation. And he, so confident, so controlled, walked straight into the lion's den. The presidential press room was unlike any he had ever seen. It wasn't large. It wasn't glamorous. There were no CNN or AFP logos, no boom mics dangling from polished rigs. Instead, 6 wooden chairs were arranged in a half-moon arc, facing a single microphone at the center. The floor tiles were clean but cracked in places. The walls bore no official insignia, just plain beige paint, and 2 ceiling fans humming steadily above. Jean-Paul walked in with calculated ease. He gave a nod to the guards, adjusted the strap of his shoulder bag, and settled into the chair farthest to the right. He opened his notebook, flicked through blank pages, then clicked his pen and waited. He didn't realize it yet, but everyone in the room had already received their role. Everyone but him. Among the 6 local journalists were 2 undercover intelligence officers posing as reporters. One held a discreet lapel mic feeding audio directly into a secure channel. The other was responsible for monitoring Jean-Paul's reactions. Behind the mirrored glass on the far end of the room, President Ibrahim Traoré stood silently with his chief of security. His arms were crossed, but his eyes were focused. He was not here to perform, he was here to confirm. Back in the room, Jean-Paul looked around, perhaps slightly confused by the lack of press materials or briefing notes. In France, a press conference without a press kit would be considered unprofessional. But here it seemed deliberate. The room was too quiet, too controlled. No reporters chatting, no cameras being adjusted, just a red light blinking softly on the ceiling, indicating the feed was already alive. When the door opened, everyone stood except Jean-Paul. He looked up, feigned surprise, then rose slowly as President Traoré entered the room, not in a suit and tie, but in olive-green fatigues. There were no bodyguards flanking him, no assistants trailing behind. He walked alone, with the calm authority of a man who knew exactly what he was walking into. Jean-Paul extended a hand. "Monsieur President, it's an honor," he said, voice rehearsed, tone respectful. Traoré shook his hand firmly, held it for half a second longer than necessary, then let go. "You've been asking many questions about our country," Traoré said evenly. "Today I will answer them. But first, I have a few of my own." Jean-Paul smiled, tight-lipped, cautious. He nodded slowly, still unsure of where this was going. "Of course. That's what interviews are for. But this wasn't going to be an interview. This was an unmasking." Traoré didn't take a seat. He stood in front of the microphone, hands behind his back. His voice was calm, firm, and unshaken. "You have been in our country for 23 days, he began. "Is that correct?" Jean-Paul cleared his throat. "Yes, Mr. President. I've been documenting stories, listening to the people, trying to understand their challenges." Traoré tilted his head slightly. "Which stories exactly?" Jean-Paul hesitated. "Security, infrastructure, regional development, trade." The president raised a hand. A soldier stepped forward from the side of the room, carrying a sealed folder. He placed it gently on the table in front of Traoré and stepped back. The folder was thick, labeled, precise. "You've visited 9 locations adjacent to military zones," Traoré continued, "including 2 areas that are restricted under our national security framework. You were not granted access. Yet you recorded footage and took photographs. For what purpose?" Jean-Paul blinked. I didn't know those areas were restricted. I was filming landscapes. I'm a visual journalist." Traoré gave a small nod, neither agreement nor dismissal. Then he opened the folder. The first image, Jean-Paul standing beside a radio tower, his phone aimed directly at a signal relay unit. The second, a screenshot of a message sent at 2:17 a.m. to a server registered in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. The subject line read, "Route visibility confirmed. Convoy pattern consistent." The third, a map of Burkina Faso, marked with digital pins, supply routes, military checkpoints, resource locations. The metadata matched his laptop. The timestamps matched his travel records. The room was silent. Jean-Paul leaned back, lips parted, no words coming out. He had prepared for questions about policies, politics, maybe even Western relations. He hadn't prepared for this, because this wasn't a challenge. It was a revelation. Traoré took a step closer. "Your device was cloned last week. Your online activity was recorded. You contacted a known agent operating under diplomatic cover in West Africa. Would you like to explain this?" Jean-Paul didn't speak. A second soldier walked in, carrying a laptop. Jean-Paul's laptop, which had been taken hours earlier without his knowledge. It was now connected to a projector. The screen lit up behind Traoré. There it was. Folder after folder of classified images, notes labeled priority, emails referencing movement schedules, and one particularly chilling file labeled observation, palace security, weak points. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply asked one question. "Do you deny this is your work?" Jean-Paul stared at the floor. His hands shook. Then, without looking up, he whispered, "No." The press room remained still, except for the hum of the projector. Traoré looked directly at the camera now. This individual entered our nation under the guise of journalism. But what he practiced was surveillance. He came not to inform, but to infiltrate. He turned back to Jean-Paul. "You came for stories, but now you are the story." And with that, he gave a quiet nod. 2 guards stepped forward. Jean-Paul didn't resist. He stood, head lowered, and followed them out of the room. But this time, he wasn't carrying the camera. He was in the frame. The footage from the press room didn't just stay inside the compound. Within 30 minutes of the confrontation, the video had already made its way onto local news networks. The feed wasn't edited. No dramatic music, no filters. Just a clean, uninterrupted stream of what had taken place between President Ibrahim Traoré and the man who had posed as a journalist. The caption was simple: "Live press briefing, presidential office." But the content, it shook the country. Clips began circulating on messaging apps almost immediately. WhatsApp groups in Ouagadougou lit up. TikTok users clipped the moment Traoré calmly said, "You came for stories, now you are the story." Twitter threads dissected the facial expressions, the hesitation, the silence. Facebook was flooded with screenshots of the maps found on the laptop, overlaid with comments like, We are not blind anymore. In cafes, people paused conversations to re-watch the moment. Radios interrupted their usual music to replay the audio of the confrontation. In villages, entire families gathered around old televisions or shared phones to witness what had just happened. No one screamed. No one cheered. There was no need. The weight of the moment carried itself. The public wasn't just reacting to a foreign agent being caught. It was the manner in which it was done. Calm, legal, transparent. In the past, accusations like this would be dismissed as conspiracy or drowned in bureaucracy. But here was visual proof. A camera, a laptop, a map. It wasn't propaganda. It was evidence. By sunset, mural artists in several cities began painting Traoré's silhouette on public walls. In the image, he stood with a calm face, one hand raised, a caption beneath, "Africa has eyes now." Even children understood the symbolism. One drawing shared by a schoolteacher showed a figure with a camera pointed at a lion, and the lion staring back. Across the region, the story rippled. In Ghana, influencers posted reactions titled, "How to Handle a Spy with No Guns." In Nigeria, journalists debated how transparency like this could redefine leadership. In Senegal, a university professor tweeted, "Burkina Faso didn't just catch a spy, they caught a system that underestimated them." Internationally, the reaction was more guarded. European outlets reported cautiously. Headlines like "French national detained in Burkina Faso" appeared, avoiding the word spy. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a short statement. "We are reviewing the situation and urge that all international norms be respected." It said nothing of the emails, nothing of the map, nothing of the footage that millions had now seen. By contrast, media across Africa called it a turning point. In editorials and talk shows, commentators praised not just the security services, but President Traoré's composure. "He didn't raise his voice," said one anchor. "He raised the standard." Inside Burkina Faso, the presidential office made no further comment. There were no victory speeches, no new declarations. The evidence had done the talking, and the people had heard it clearly. But for President Traoré, this was never about just one man. The very next morning, he called a private meeting with his cabinet, his intelligence chief, and several advisors. The topic wasn't the arrest. It was the system. How had the man entered the country so easily? Who cleared his press credentials? What digital vulnerabilities had he exploited? Traoré didn't want applause, he wanted answers. Over the next 72 hours, his administration launched an internal audit of foreign correspondence, embassy communications, and cybersecurity protocols. Teams worked around the clock to trace other digital footprints linked to the agent. What they found suggested this wasn't a one-time incident. There had been others. Not all as bold, but present. But again, Traoré didn't act with anger. He acted with purpose. 3 days later, he appeared in public again, not in his palace, not behind glass, but in a rural school courtyard. The press wasn't invited, only people, farmers, teachers, drivers, students. Some had come from hours away just to hear him speak. He stood in front of them without a script. "They've been watching us," he began, "not to understand us, but to control us." He looked at the children sitting in front. They sent a man with a camera, but it wasn't for stories. It was for surveillance, and he wasn't the first. He paused. "But he will be the last." The crowd stayed silent, not because they were afraid, but because the moment demanded respect. Then, softly, Traoré said, "Don't mistake our silence for blindness. We see you now." Those words would travel faster than any drone. Across buses, campus walls, and graffiti-lined alleyways, one phrase began to repeat, "We see you now." The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was intention. In the days after the press conference that shook not only Burkina Faso but an entire continent, President Ibrahim Traoré disappeared from headlines, but not from history. He didn't give more speeches. He didn't celebrate the operation. He didn't need to, because the truth had already done the speaking. The man who had come with a press badge and a camera lens remained under custody, not hidden in some remote cell, but held in a high secretary monitored facility on the outskirts of the capital. His rights were not stripped. He had access to legal representation and regular health checks. No photos of him were leaked. No names were shouted. The country refused to make him a spectacle. Instead, it chose dignity, transparency, and quiet strength. Outside, the story continued to spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about a spy being caught. It was about how he was caught. Without gunshots, without violence, without humiliation, just questions, facts, and the weight of a calm voice asking, "Do you deny this is your work?" Burkinabe citizens had seen political theater before. They had seen chaos. But this was something new. It was discipline. It was control. It was justice, executed with surgical precision. Across Africa, the effects rippled. In Ghana, civil society groups hosted roundtables on sovereignty and digital threats. In Nigeria, student unions organized screenings of the press conference followed by open mic discussions. In Côte d'Ivoire, where the foreign server had been traced, citizens questioned their own government's transparency. In Cameroon, a social media trend began called "We See You Now," used to call out corruption and foreign meddling in local affairs. But back in Burkina Faso, the response was deeper. It wasn't just online. It was cultural. It was structural. Traoré hadn't just embarrassed a foreign agent. He had exposed vulnerabilities in how information was handled, how credentials were granted, and how easily trust could be faked. So, he acted, not with speeches, but with policy. In the week following the exposure, a presidential directive was issued silently but firmly, a nationwide review of all foreign press and NGO operations. This wasn't a purge. It wasn't paranoia. It was housekeeping. Departments were instructed to verify press affiliations, confirm project scopes, and reevaluate who had access to what. What surprised most observers wasn't that this happened, but how it happened. There were no mass expulsions, no witch hunts, no fear-based broadcasts. Instead, Burkina Faso announced a new digital registry for all foreign media professionals operating in the country. The process was simple, public, and quick. It emphasized collaboration, not control. But it sent a clear message: transparency is not optional anymore. At the same time, the president called for the creation of the Citizen Insight Corps, a volunteer-based civic watchdog group composed of students, journalists, teachers, and tech workers. Their mission? Monitor ethical behavior in media, debunk disinformation, and promote digital literacy. Within days, hundreds signed up. Universities offered credit for participation, private firms donated cybersecurity tools. Local radio stations offered airtime for public awareness shows. The nation had seen what could happen when the line between journalism and espionage was blurred. Now they were drawing that line in ink. But beyond policy and reform, something else changed. Something harder to quantify. It was posture. Before the incident, many citizens felt their voice didn't matter. Foreign organizations came and went, governments made decisions above their heads, and cameras pointed at them without asking permission. But now, with one press conference, that psychology was shifting. People spoke up. Taxi drivers debated national security. Market vendors discussed digital sovereignty. Even school children, when asked about what they wanted to be, began saying things like, "I want to protect our country's information." And still, Ibrahim Traoré remained mostly silent. He appeared at small gatherings, unannounced, a visit to a community farming co-op, a brief drop-in at a teacher's training event. He was photographed less and less by official media and more by ordinary citizens who shared unedited images of a president listening, walking, learning. When a European journalist asked in a podcast why Traoré hadn't done a follow-up interview, a local analyst responded, "Because he doesn't need to. The story is already finished, and he let the people tell it. Meanwhile, international governments remained careful. France, whose intelligence reputation had quietly taken a hit, avoided escalation. Behind closed doors, diplomatic envoys requested meetings, tried to reframe the incident, and sought clarity on the accusations. But the documents had been published, the footage had been watched, the map, the emails, the timestamps. They were out there. Silence became the only defense. In the academic world, Traoré's strategy became a case study. Professors of international relations dissected the calm method of confrontation. Ethics scholars discussed the implications of narrative sovereignty. Tech summits across the continent started including panels on digital infiltration and the power of citizen surveillance. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was not in what Traoré dismantled, but what he built. In a public primary school outside the capital, a new classroom wing opened, funded by a coalition of tech companies inspired by the event. The students named the building Truth Hall. On the wall, hand-painted by the children, were 5 words in bold lettering. "We see you, we speak too." What had started as an exposure became an awakening. And the man who had tried to tell Africa's story by stealing it, he was gone, held quietly, awaiting trial, no longer central to the headlines. In the end, he got what he came for, attention, but not on his terms. As for President Traoré, he returned to his routines. Morning briefings, national consultations, visits to remote provinces, and every so often, he'd pass by a wall, a shirt, or a blackboard scribbled with the now iconic phrase, "He never stopped to pose." He didn't need to, because the people were now watching, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. Time moved on. The world, as it always does, shifted its attention elsewhere. New conflicts emerged, new headlines dominated. But in Burkina Faso, one moment refused to fade. It wasn't just about a spy being caught, it was about how a nation found its voice, quietly, powerfully, and on its own terms. In Ouagadougou, the murals painted in the days after the exposure still stood, some repainted by volunteers, others faded but preserved like memory scars on the city walls. One near a market read, "We see you now, not in defiance but in declaration." It wasn't meant to threaten, it was meant to remind. Across the countryside, the moment lived on in stories passed between generations. Grandmothers recounted how the president stood in silence, letting the truth speak. Farmers shared radio recordings with their neighbors over shared meals. Even children in rural classrooms could recite the key phrases from the confrontation, not because they were forced to learn them, but because they had felt the weight of those words. What made this moment endure wasn't its drama, but its dignity. President Ibrahim Traoré never used it as a political trophy. He didn't rename public spaces, didn't install statues, didn't launch propaganda. In fact, he rarely spoke about it again, but that silence was strategic. It allowed the people to carry the message themselves. In doing so, something profound happened. The center of gravity shifted. Where once Africa's narratives were shaped abroad through foreign media, NGOs, or think tanks, now, more and more, they were being shaped at home. By students, by artists, by citizens. This was no longer just a reaction, it was a rewriting. A rewriting of who gets to speak, of who gets to define integrity, security, and sovereignty. In universities across the continent, courses began using the press conference as a case study in modern leadership, not because of confrontation, but because of control. Ibrahim Traoré had demonstrated that leadership was not measured in how loud one spoke, but in how much truth one could stand in front of and hold still. In Senegal, university students began producing short films reenacting the confrontation, not for dramatization, but for reflection. In Kenya, artists created augmented reality murals that allowed viewers to scan a wall and hear local stories of resistance, inspired by Burkina Faso's moment. In Ghana, spoken word poets performed verses beginning with, "We see you now," each interpretation uniquely tied to local injustices, reclaiming the phrase for their own. And in Europe, some journalists, quietly, cautiously, began asking themselves uncomfortable questions. How many stories had they told on behalf of Africa without ever fully understanding it? How many investigations had relied on the assumption that local voices needed to be interpreted through a Western lens? The questions didn't always lead to answers, but they left cracks. And in those cracks, something new grew: respect. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, change took tangible form. Traoré's administration rolled out a national program on media literacy aimed at secondary school students and community leaders. The goal was simple: help people understand how information is created, framed, and sometimes weaponized, not to restrict knowledge, but to empower it. The government invested in local journalism, funding regional media outlets with transparent grants and zero editorial control. The message was clear: we don't fear the media, we strengthen it, but it must be ours. It must be rooted in truth. Foreign correspondents weren't expelled. They were engaged, invited to workshops on ethical reporting, briefed on the new digital registry, and encouraged to build partnerships with local reporters. It wasn't a purge, it was a reset. And for many, it felt long overdue. One French journalist, who had covered African affairs for over 15 years, wrote in a personal blog post, "I used to think I was helping tell African stories, but now I realize I was often standing in front of them. This new generation doesn't need my voice. They need space for their own." Such reflections didn't erase history, but they opened doors for new chapters. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré, remained remarkably unchanged. No cult of personality emerged around him. He declined portraits, refused praise, and once reportedly stopped a school from naming a library after him, saying, "Books should carry the names of authors, not presidents." But the people still remembered, not in slogans or songs, but in behavior. Parents began telling their children to verify stories before sharing them. Street vendors started asking questions when approached by foreign surveyors. Village chiefs held forums about data collection and consent. The memory of the press conference had become a cultural marker, like a quiet bell that rings whenever the line between curiosity and intrusion is crossed. In global summits, African leaders now reference the event as a pivot point in how the continent manages external relationships. One East African minister remarked, "We used to be afraid to question foreign intentions. Now, we're simply not afraid to ask, 'Why are you here, and who are you speaking for?'" But perhaps the most lasting change came in the classrooms. In a small, rural school, a teacher ended her history lesson not with a test, but with a question. "If you could speak for your country, what would you say?" A young girl raised her hand. She didn't hesitate. "We are not weak, we are not voiceless, we are just not finished yet." The room fell silent, and that silence, that powerful, echoing silence, was the proof that Traoré's calm defiance had done more than stop a spy. It had sparked a movement, not of protesters, but of protectors. Not of slogans, but of storytellers. Not of outrage, but of ownership. Ownership of history, of voice, of dignity. And years from now, when the name of the foreign operative fades into obscurity and the headlines have long been archived, the phrase will remain, painted on the walls of a continent that decided to see itself clearly, finally and unapologetically. We see you now. In a world overflowing with noise, cameras, and attention, sometimes the most powerful thing a nation can do is watch. Not with suspicion, not with hatred, but with clarity. Because the greatest threat isn't always the bullet. Sometimes, it's the smile that hides the wire, the question that masks the motive, the lens that looks, but doesn't listen. For too long, Africa has been seen, but not seen clearly, interpreted, not heard, framed, but never framed by itself. But now, something has changed. When President Ibrahim Traoré stood in front of that camera, he didn't just expose a spy. He exposed a system of expectation, a belief that Africans would always be the subjects, never the narrators, that truth would be handed to them, not spoken by them. He shattered that expectation, not by shouting, not by violence, but by doing something far more radical. He listened, and then he looked back. And that look, that calm, steady gaze into the camera, did more than confront a man. It confronted history. It said, "We know you, we see you, and we are watching now." That kind of seeing, intentional, intelligent, grounded, is the beginning of power. Not the power to dominate, but the power to define. And once a people can define themselves, they cannot be defined by anyone else again. That's the real story. Not the man who came with the camera, but the nation that decided to turn the camera around. If you've watched until this point, you already know this is not just a story about a spy. It's a story about awareness, about sovereignty, about seeing what we were never supposed to see. Because for too long, the world has assumed Africa doesn't watch, doesn't question, doesn't push back. But now, Africa is watching. Africa is answering. And it's not just about Burkina Faso. It's about every small nation told to be quiet. Every young voice told to wait their turn. Every community filmed, studied, used, without ever being asked first. Now it's our turn to speak, to tell our stories, to define what truth means to us. So if this story moved you, don't just like it, share it. Speak about it, let it travel. Talk to someone about narrative sovereignty. Challenge the next documentary you see. Ask yourself, whose voice is this? Who benefits from the version being told? We're no longer in an era where only the powerful get to tell the story. Now, those who were once watched have started watching back. So, let's make sure this message doesn't stop here. Because the world may forget. But we won't. We see you now. And we will keep seeing. In the end, this wasn't just a moment in a room. It was a mirror, held up to power, to silence, to history itself. And what we saw, we can't unsee. The question now isn't whether the world is watching Africa. The question is Africa watching back? Because from this moment on, every camera turned toward this continent will feel a little heavier. Every question asked will be heard a little louder. And every silence will speak a little more truth. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay awake, stay aware, and never stop asking, who's holding the camera now?